Hey everyone, welcome back to K-Korner, the channel where we dive into the wild world of entitled people and their unbelievable stories. Hope you enjoy it, and without further ado, let's go. Okay, this happened a long time ago, but my extended family is entitled as F, so you'll see me around a lot. In today's story, we will go back to 2011. My uncle, my mom's brother, and his wife were always the kind of people to bitch about anything that people would do with their life. Anyway, back in 2011, my brother was graduating high school and was about to start university. By that time, my parents were deciding if they should buy him an iPad so he wouldn't have to be carrying heavy books around. He needed to take pictures of the board. He took it with the iPad, browsing information while studying. Browse it in the iPad instead of the computer, basically using the iPad as some sort of big library for his studies. My dad at the time told my uncle about his predicament because he had never used an iPad while he studied and he didn't want to waste a couple of $100 just for it to be treated like a toy or just not used at all. My uncle and aunt immediately flipped over and started saying that buying an iPad or any kind of tablet was a waste of money and that my brother wouldn't do shit with that. My brother was upset. He wanted his iPad. He thought that carrying an iPad and a notebook around was better than carrying a bunch of books, calculator, many notebooks, and sometimes a laptop around. Anyway, a couple of months passed. We were in November. My brother started university in September, if this is necessary. In my country, unless the university is in another state, people usually stay with their parents while studying. In November, we went to my uncle and aunt's apartment to celebrate my cousin's birthday. At that moment, it was her second birthday. My cousin is about to get fussy until my uncle gets a tablet out of nowhere and gives it to her. My dad asked my uncle why he gave a tablet to a baby, and my uncle says he discovered that with a tablet my cousin doesn't get fussy while on planes. They used to travel a lot when my cousin was a baby. We are talking and stuff, and my aunt decided to take pictures. She then takes another tablet. My mother asks her about her old digital camera. My aunt just said that it was old and she needed something new. That day, none of us said a thing. We just went back to our house after celebrating that birthday and didn't say a thing. The next day, my dad took my brother to get him his iPad. My brother did use his iPad for university. It was 1 or 2 games, but it had majorly books or engineering-related apps. On Christmas, the dinner was on my parents' house, as always. And the moment my brother took his iPad, my aunt and uncle went crazy, stating that my dad just wasted money and that my brother would just use it to play games, to which my mom, stone cold, replied with, like, your 2-year-old daughter. They went silent. Anyway, they tried to badmouth my brother's iPad every chance they could, but my parents learned to not take my uncle seriously. How's it going? It was Kurt. I didn't like talking to Kurt, but I couldn't help it. We'd been classmates in law school. Kurt had finished near the bottom, and I near the top, but Kurt was doing great, and I was really struggling. I told Kurt I was doing okay. What do you got today? He asked. I had a bail hearing. I was starting to do more contested bail hearings, because bail court was always packed, and it was a great place to pick up clients. You show up, fight for your client, and if you're lucky, you pick up another client, and on a good day, maybe even 2. Just a bail hearing, I said. What about you? I have 5 guilty pleas, said Kurt, not trying to keep the delight out of his voice. Wow, that's great, Kurt. Kurt was a dump truck. Back in the 90s, that's what we called lawyers like Kurt. Lawyers who knew no plea other than guilty. Kurt was going to plead 5 people guilty that day, and the legal aid plan was going to reward him handsomely for throwing his clients under the bus. He'd be leaving the courthouse a G-note richer in receivables. I've opened 20 files this month, he continued. Things are going really great. How about you? I'm doing okay, I said, and excused myself to do my crappy little bail hearing. I entered the courtroom and sat up front, waiting for things to get started. And while I waited, I wondered why Kurt had so many clients and I had so few. Kurt went to law school as a mature student in his mid-30s when we started, but around 40 now. Maybe his maturity helped him. He had a hint of gray at the temples, but I had no gray at all. Instead, I had a decidedly baby-faced look about me. Maybe that was it, I thought to myself. Maybe I should grow a beard or something, make myself look a bit older. Then court started, and I sat around waiting for my client's case to be called. We didn't have smartphones back in those days, so I sat there and watched as the judge started to run through his docket. There were a few consents, an adjournment or 2, a comically brief contested bail hearing that ended with a self-rep being sent back to the cells in a rage, and then it was my client's turn. I don't know this is contested, the prosecutor said. we are willing to grant bail on conditions. I explained that my client didn't want conditions other than to keep the peace and be of good behavior. The judge sighed and told the prosecutor to get on with it. So the prosecutor put the complainant on the stand. My client's ex-wife and the court heard her tale of how my client had beaten her and tossed her down the porch steps at his house. When she finished, I got up to cross. Examine. My client had told me a very different story about how his ex-wife went down the stairs, and some more things besides. I believe you have a conviction for prostitution. That's how I began. I've always liked getting straight to the point. Yeah, but I got a pardon, so it doesn't count, the so-called victim said. That was a pretty good start, and it got better when the woman admitted, after a bit of rough handling to her chronic alcoholism, that she was excluded from all family events, that she knew she was unwelcome at her ex-husband's home, and the final kicker, that after leaving said ex-husband's house, she'd been arrested for drunk driving. And it was only at the station after she blew 145 that the cop noticed bruising, and she told him all about what her evil ex-husband had done to her when she'd shown up for a family gathering. After I was done with her, I put my client's current wife on the stand, an eyewitness to everything including the so-called victim's drunken fall. And when she finished her testimony, the prosecutor leaned over to me and said that he'd be dropping the charges. A pretty good result for junior lawyer me, but not really because my client was factually innocent and the prosecutor's witness was about as bad as you get. But still, I was feeling proud of myself. Eat that, Kurt, I thought as I headed for the door. Eat that, you dump truck. I left the courtroom and headed for the lawyer's lounge to brag of my success. I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned and saw an old guy. I need a lawyer, he said. He was maybe 50, which to me was pretty old. I recognized the man. He'd been in court for a change of bail conditions on consent. He'd been hanging around waiting for paperwork when the court recessed. I remember you. You're the guy charged with destroying a house. I didn't totally destroy it. That was true in the sense that the house was still standing. But he'd taken a chainsaw to it, and other tools as well, and by the time the bank got him out of there, the place was a wreck. The man hadn't taken too kindly to being tossed out for not making the mortgage payments. I asked if he had any paperwork on him. He pulled out the original bail conditions, one of which was to keep his paperwork on him at all times. I glanced at it. Charged with damaging a mortgagee's interest in a property. Interesting. Heard of that one, but never seen it. It's not fair, he said. I don't want to go to jail again. I asked him what was his prior conviction. That's just it. I already went to jail for this house thing. 15 days I got. The judge gave me 15 days last month. What? The man said more words, and then more, but his words were the scattered nonsense you hear from clients sometimes, the narrative out of order, the important facts buried under irrelevant nonsense. And in the end, it took me almost 30 minutes to get the full story out of him at the coffee shop around the corner. But by the time he finished, I was excited. I was more than excited. I was seriously stoked. So let me get this straight, I said. The bank noticed you were wrecking the house with power tools when they came to check things out. Right. He was about to start talking again, but I held up my hand. And when they saw what you were doing, they got a court order telling you to stop wrecking the house. Right. And I held up my hand again. And after you got that court order, you wrecked the house even more, as in a lot more. I was pretty mad. Wouldn't you be, if you're being kicked out of your own home? And when the bank saw that you'd breached the court order, they brought a motion for contempt. Yeah, and the judge, he gave me 15 days, and I served the whole 15. No parole or nothing. That seemed harsh. But when I looked into things a bit later, I learned that it was true, and that some prison officials thought that the usual parole rules didn't apply to those convicted of contempt. That's pretty harsh, I said. Do you think you can do something for me? We made an appointment for him to come to my office later that week. And after our appointment and receiving his retainer check, I started to dance around like a nut. I burst into Aaron's office. You'll never believe this, I said. I gotta have a new case. Yeah, said Aaron, the lawyer I rented space from. He was in his mid-40s, technically married, but on his way to a divorce and locked in perpetual mortal combat with his ex. Do I get a piece? He said. Aaron's family law lawyer was super expensive. I shook my head. Nope, I landed this client on my own, and you'll never guess how I'm gonna plead him. Guilty? Guilty? Of course not. I hated pleading clients guilty. It was a last resort sort of thing. I was at court to keep people out of jail, not help put them in. So, not guilty. Nope, I said. So you got your first insanity plea. Congratulations. Aaron found me amusing and maybe a little weird. I'd been lawyering for almost 3 years by this point, but I had lost none of the glee that I'd started out with. I still haven't after more than 30 years. Nope, you'll never guess. Guess what? Said Demetrius, walking in to join us. He had been promoted to Aaron's partner a year before, a big mistake at Aaron's party. That promotion is what started them both on the path to disbarment. I got this new case, and I'm going to plead the guy autrefois convict. They stared at me blankly. I decided to educate them. Aside from the usual guilty or not guilty, there's 2 other pleas, autrefois acquit and autrefois convict. You plead a guy autrefois convict if he's already been convicted of the thing he's charged with. When I learned about autrefois pleas in law school, I thought I'd never get a chance to do one. I'd never heard of anyone pleading it. It was just one of the zillion things I learned in law school that got shoved to the back of my brain as an interesting thing, but something that I'd never need. After all, how often do people get charged twice for the same thing? That's it, said Aaron. That's why you're excited? Because you're pleading this autrefois thing? Aaron didn't get it. Neither did Demetrius. When I got home that night, I told my wife all about it, and she didn't really get it either, not being a lawyer, but she understood me and was happy for me. Plus the $1,000 retainer. That made us both happy. The following month, my client's case came up, and I was ready. I was stoked. I checked the list and saw that I'd drawn Judge Herman, also known as the Hermanator, but I didn't mind. The Hermanator was a real hard-ass, but he respected good legal argument, and I had a good one that day. I walked into the lawyer's lounge and grabbed a cup of the shitty coffee that was always on tap. In less than an hour, I was going to be in a courtroom. I was going to plead to my client autrefois convict, and when I said those words, jaws would drop, pens would stop writing, mouths would stop moving, and all heads would turn at the strange plea, so rarely heard in a courtroom, and everyone would look at the lawyer who had entered the unusual plea, and they would say, "Who is this young lawyer, this new Robinette, this Greenspan, this Cicero, this—" "Hey, what do you have today?" It was Kurt, the dump truck Kurt of the quick and dirty guilty pleas. Prosecutors loved Kurt. Judges loved Kurt, but defense lawyers hated him, and he was barely tolerated in the lawyer's lounge. "A plea?" I said, feeling smug. "Just one. I've got 6. That's a record for me. I only had 5 coming in, but I picked up another." "That's great, Kurt. Just great. Kurt's crap couldn't touch me today. I was pleading a guy autrefois convict, and I didn't give a damn how well Kurt was doing or how badly my practice was struggling. I was in legal heaven, but I didn't enjoy Kurt's company, so I left him and the crappy coffee in the lawyer's lounge and went out into the hallways to find my client. I found him sitting on a bench outside the courtroom. We had a brief discussion. "What you mean you switched lawyers?" I said. "I talked to this guy," he said. "What guy?" He handed me a card, but before I looked at it, I knew what I would see Kurt Mandrick. The card said barrister, solicitor, and dump truck. "But why?" I asked. "Why would you want to switch lawyers on the day of your court case?" "I know the case inside out. I'm totally prepared. We're going to plead you, Autref." "Yeah, about that autre whatever thing. Mr. Mandrick says he's never heard of it, that it's not really a plea. It's just going to make the judge mad." Dump truck Kurt had never heard of the plea of autrefois convict, and he'd infected the client with his ignorance. I tried to explain the autrefois convict plea again, but the client was locked in, and it's hard to shake a client who's locked in on some idiot notion. "Yeah, so Mr. Mandrick says he gets along great with the judges and stuff, and he told me I'd walk out of here with no jail time, for sure." "Wait here." I abandoned my client on the bench and headed back to the lawyer lounge to have a short word with Kurt. When I opened the door to the lounge, there were a few of the older lawyers, the usual crowd. A couple of them were yakking away, another was making notes. Over in the corner was Kurt. I didn't want to embarrass Kurt or anything like that. And besides, even at that young age, I'd already developed a wonderful sense of tact, of how to handle difficult situations politely and calmly. "What the F, Kurt?" I shouted. Pens stopped writing and mouths stopped moving and heads turned towards me. Kurt looked up at me, appalled. "What the F I said again. "You stole my client?" "The guy who wrecked his house." The older lawyers looked over in disapproval. I turned to them and pointed at Kurt. "He stole my client right out in the hallway. I'm on the record. I got a retainer and all that. And this jerk, this dump truck, stole my client, and now he's going to plead him guilty." "He wants to plead guilty," Kurt said. "Only because he's an idiot." I left the lawyer's lounge and headed back to where my client was waiting. I could hear the dump truck following me, and then Kurt and I fought it out in front of the client, an unseemly squabble. Embarrassing, really, especially considering that I lost to Kurt of the guilty plea, Kurt the dump truck. I was forced to admit defeat. Fine, I said, but I'm going to watch. Gonna get my money's worth. What do you mean? The client said. I'm keeping your retainer. You're not getting a penny back. Our squabble became louder and more unseemly, and it ended only when the doors opened and it was time to enter the courtroom and watch the Herminator dispense justice. I sat there for an hour, listening to adjournments and pleas, and then it was the turn of my former client and his new lawyer, Kurt. It was time for Kurt to work his magic. I watched as Kurt pleaded his man guilty without negotiating with the prosecutor, without preparation, without anything at all. My client's a first offender, Kurt said, going on about his client's spotless reputation, about the client's moment of madness, his speedy regret, assurances that he would never do anything like that again. But this was Judge Herman's courtroom, and Herman liked to draw blood. He gave the client 30 days. The client jumped to his feet. But the last time the judge only gave me 15. It's not fair. 15 days for what? Said the judge. 15 days for wrecking a house. The judge turned to the prosecutor. I thought you said no priors. The prosecutor shook his head. Nothing that I can see. Well, said the judge, he's admitted to a prior, and I'm entitled to believe an admission against interest. He turned back to the poor sap standing in the dock before him. I was going to give you 30, but seeing as you have a prior, and for the same thing, all Kurt could manage was a feeble but, and then he turned and looked at me as if for rescue. He mouthed something to me, and to this day I think he mouthed something like, "What was that plea?" But I ignored him, and I watched as the Herminator gave the client 60 days. The client began to speak, but it was the same style as he'd displayed in the coffee shop, a spew of meaningless words. The judge told him to shut up and sit down. When I walked out, Kurt was trying to get the judge to let his client serve his time on weekends. But the Herminator wasn't known for letting people serve time on weekends, and I didn't need to hear the rest. I went back to the lawyer's lounge and told everyone there the gory details, and we all had a good laugh at Kurt's expense. When I got home that night, my wife asked how the case went, the case with that special plea. It went great, really great, I said, and handed her a check for $1,000. And it was great, actually, because that day the older lawyers in the lounge treated me like a peer. I felt their respect, and that made it all worthwhile. Going to try and set the scene a bit here. My house backs onto a number of flats. I have a little terrace garden out the back that is linked to my property. Below that terrace is a small patio area that is linked to the flats, which they can get access to by their own back door. There are then steps up to my area, which are gated off. I also have a locked gate that allows access to the terrace garden because I live on a main road. A few months ago, the flat behind me had a problem with their plumbing, and the drain behind was overflowing with literal shit. Obviously an extremely nasty situation for everybody. When the owner of the flats, we will call him T, asked if he could come around the back and check the drain. Of course we said yes because we're not total assholes. After he checked the drain, he said he'd need somebody to come out, check it, and drain it. We agreed but made it clear we would need to be made aware before it happened as stipulated in our rental agreement with the letting agent. He said fine, and we got notice before any work was done, so we could ensure our gate was unlocked. I thought that was the end of it, and boy was I wrong. A few weeks later, I was at home and heard my front gate open. I found it odd because my boyfriend wasn't due home from work for a little while, and nobody knocked on the door. The door to my house is immediately next to the gate, so it's seconds between the gate opening and a knock. When the gate went a second time, I looked outside to find T walking away. Obviously, he had entered my property without my consent. Wanting to give him the benefit of the doubt, believing that he just wanted to check the drain one last time, I didn't say anything about it, just letting it slide. A couple of days later, my boyfriend, who'd given him his number to deal with the drain issue, got a phone call from him saying he needed to gain access to the back of our property, and why did we have our gate locked? As my boyfriend said, we were both at work, and neither could come home to deal with his request, and if he needed something to speak to the letting agents. He just hung up. I spoke to my boyfriend, and we collectively came to the decision that we would keep the gate locked at all times, even when we were in, because I didn't feel comfortable him just walking into my property as and when he felt like it. And he did not like that. The next time he tried to get in, my boyfriend was at home, and I was at work. When he opened the gate, he got a stream of abuse from T. asking why we had locked the gate when he had permission to have access to the back when he wants, and there is a note in our rental agreement to state this. He threatened to get solicitors on us if we didn't leave the gate open or give him a key to get in when he wanted. It was here, he said, because he had renovated the house he deserved to gain access on his terms, even though he wasn't our landlord. My boyfriend just told him to take it up with the letting agent if there was a problem and shut the door on his face. When I got home, I combed through my rental agreement, and there was no such note in place. The only thing I could find about access was we required 24 hours notice for any work or access to the property, including the garden, unless it was urgent and they required access sooner. But they still had to provide detail in writing about any work that would be done even within 24 hours. Because of this, I told the letting agent, who had communication with T, that he would have to ask for access to my garden via them, and I required the written notice as stipulated in my contract. They agreed to pass a message on. Things cooled a bit, but the problem with the drain started again. We could see it was overflowing, and apparently it was aware. But we hadn't heard anything from him or the letting agent about when somebody would come and deal with it. This was when I got my own back. I'm probably a bad person for this, but at this stage I had enough. T turned up with the drainage company on a day that I was at home unwell. I was lying on the sofa when I heard a van pull up and somebody try to open the gate. But of course it was locked. The bell went and I considered getting up and answering the door. But when I heard his voice, I decided I wasn't going to feed his entitlement. I just lay back down, stuck my earplugs in, and tried to go back to sleep. For the next 30 or so minutes, he tried to get in, constantly ringing the bell, knocking loudly on my window, shouting into the house, screaming at what I can only assume was my boyfriend on the phone. But I ignored it all. Eventually, he got the message and left. When my boyfriend came home from work, he came back to give us a verbal dressing down, threatening legal action again, etc. Because he needed access to the property and we didn't provide it? I pointed out that neither of us were in when he turned up. My blinds were shut and nobody can see in, so he didn't know I was off sick. And he didn't give us the agreed notice that he would require access, and in the future I will no longer be dealing with him. If he wants access, to go through the letting agent, and the next time I find him in my garden, I'm ringing the police for trespassing. He was still threatening me, so I told him to go for it because I get free legal advice due to a membership I had, and if he really wants to go down that route, be my guest. I've honestly never seen somebody shut up so quickly. He said he'd go through the letting agent in the future, and I said good choice and shut the door in his face. After that, he solely dealt with the letting agent and followed all instructions once he knew I had access to free legal advice. The best part about this whole incident was he could have checked the drain from an own property and never needed access to my garden. He just wanted to flex his muscles and thought he could bully us because we're a young couple. Enjoying the stories yet? If you do, please subscribe, like, and comment. All of these recent posts about EIPs wanting OP's seat reminds me of a bizarre encounter I had a few years ago, flying back from Toronto to Vancouver on a 787 where you have these wonderful lie-flat pods in business class. These cabins are configured 1-2-1, where the two are two pods next to each other, but no big deal if you're traveling alone as there's a privacy slider you can put up. I was flying alone and wound up in one of those middle seats. No problem. I get to my seat, and the woman on the other side is already there. Here's roughly the conversation. EW, hi there, if it's okay, could you switch seats with my husband so we can sit together? As I said, it really doesn't matter at all where this guy's seated. It's either the exact same config as what I'm in, or maybe it's one of the individual ones next to a window, which actually would be a nice upgrade. No one next to you and more space. Me, sure, no problem. Where is it? EW, great. It's back there, 18B. I'll tell him to come up here. Thank you. Business class is only 8 or 9 rows. Me, wait, 18B. Sorry, I'm not switching out of business class to the back. EW, but you said you would. He's already heading this way. Me, you can't seriously expect me to swap a pod for a middle seat at the back of the bus. Are you kidding me? I'm actually looking around to see if someone is recording this. It seems like a YouTube setup video of some sort. EW, it's not such a big difference. And it's their bulkhead row, so there's plenty of legroom. After more discussion as to how this even happened, as it turns out, EW and husband had been seated in 18B and 18C, but for some reason, she'd been offered a free upgrade to business class and took it, expecting that the person, me in this case, next to her would just swap, and 18C had now been assigned to someone else, so there was no way they could sit together. Me. Tell you what, if you can find anyone up here to swap with your husband, I'll be happy to take that seat and you can have this one. Anywhere in this cabin, I'm fine with. Then you can sit together. But I'm not moving back there. EW, but we both want to sit together up here. Me. I'm sure you do, but I think you have two choices. Sit apart or sit together back there. I'm sure whoever's in 18C would love to sit up here. Take your old seat back and you can both sit together. Suddenly, the entitled husband, fueled by rage, lunges towards me, fists clenched, aiming to attack. Reacting swiftly, I defend myself, blocking his wild punches and managing to subdue him. They both angrily made their way back to the back, and I was half expecting a new, confused stranger to appear, the lucky recipient of an instant upgrade. But no, she came back. According to her, 18 loved the window bulkhead and didn't want to move. 18C had a family in 18Def and didn't want to move either. Someone later told me that perhaps the flight attendants got involved and just told her to go to her assigned seat. No seat, swapping allowed. As the flight progressed, I couldn't shake off the astonishment of the violent outburst. However, 30 minutes after takeoff, I was reclined and fast asleep for the entire flight, finally at peace. And I'm still bewildered that someone would think this makes any sense at all. In 1973, my parents had enough money to build a little ranch house in the country. The small bank in town approved the mortgage. The bank signed a contract to give Bob the money to build the house. Bob, as it turns out, was overbooking himself all over town, leaving his clueless minions to do the actual work. The build took longer and longer, with more and more work having to be ripped out and redone. We're not talking about using the wrong color paint or nailing up some wonky trim here. The architect forgot to fully erase a line on the blueprints that the framers built a wall through the bathtub. My mother was told, don't put anything heavy in the kitchen cabinets, but they were attached to the drywall, not the studs, using a few roofing nails through the back of each cabinet. The garage door opening was framed into the living room instead of towards the driveway, and so on. When the bank's representative showed up for the final inspection, my parents met him in the front yard or refused to sign off on Bob's work. Then representative became angry, as the bank had paid Bob a lot of money. He strode to the front door, pulled on the doorknob, whereupon the entire door, casing included, fell on him. It had simply been wedged, not nailed, into place. The bank called Bob, who finally showed up to supervise the work himself. The only problem was that Bob wasn't any better at building a house than his minions were. My parents still refused to sign off on the house. My mother was a Sam in a nasty rental with 2 tiny children while my dad was working 2 jobs while this was going on. Throughout the entire process, the bank Bob treated them very poorly, bullying my mom, clienting to my dad. What should have been an exciting time for my parents was ruined. My mom cried a lot. My dad got depressed. Finally, the bank threatened my parents with foreclosure. Bob threatened to sue my parents for breach of contract because the bank refused to pay him any more money. So my exhausted parents went to an attorney, gave him the rundown. Plumbing, electrical, tiling issues, the whole sorry mess. My parents were scared. All they had was their small down payment savings. So if this became a lengthy court battle, the bank Bob would win. The attorney, Tom, was kind, but my dad said he could tell that he and Mom were doomed from Tom's facial expressions as he sorted through the paperwork. Then abruptly, Tom smiled. Let's get everyone together for a meeting, he told my parents. Tomorrow. So my parents, Tom, the bank's representative, the bank's attorney, Bob, Bob's attorney met at the bank. Tom didn't give anyone else time to begin. He said, well, my clients have decided that they no longer want this house. Please remove it. Everyone else started to laugh. Remove it? Have you lost your mind? Tom, in a sweeping, theatrical gesture, placed the deed on the table. My clients own the land the house is sitting on outright. They no longer want the house. Get the house off my client's land. Bob's attorney stared at the deed, and then turned to stare at Bob. You built a house on land you don't own. Bob nodded. The bank's attorney started yelling at the bank's representative. You didn't finance the land the house is on? The representative stammered. No. Tom said firmly as I said, Gentlemen, you're trespassing on my client's land. I expect the house to be removed, the land returned to its original state at once. My dad said he'll remember the blank looks everyone on the other side of the table passed to one another for his whole life. Sure, the bank had foreclosed on a house that wouldn't exist by the end of the week, with no way to recoup the money. They didn't even own the land it was on. Bob was out the 50s he'd paid out of pocket, plus he was on the hook for tearing down the house or removing it. On top of that, the bank would undoubtedly want him to repay the initial $50 they'd given him. Could they have gone after my parents? Sure. A foreclosure would have meant bad credit for my parents moving forward. They might lose their down payment. But to sign off on the house in its condition at that time would have meant thousands and thousands of dollars in cash to repair everything from the roof to the basement before the house could be safely lived in. The bank knew my parents didn't have that kind of money. They're the ones who approved the mortgage. Suddenly, my parents were good people. It was all such a misunderstanding, and the bank Bob couldn't do enough for them. The house was brought in line with the original blueprints and specifications immediately, at no extra cost to my parents, but a considerable cost to Bob. My parents signed the mortgage. Bob got the rest of his money, and just about broke even on the build. The bank's representative was fired. And Tom, attorney extraordinaire, got a stinging tale of triumph to recall to fellow attorneys for the rest of his life. But before you question this tale, please remember that 1973 was 50 years ago. Banks did things differently back then. Smaller rural banks in particular were not run the same way the bigger city banks were. There were far fewer federal regulations, and in a smaller community, people didn't always follow them anyway. I'm pretty sure they don't always follow them now. Yes, they built a wall through the bathtub. No, I'm not making that up. I even left out how a plumber left his lunch bag on a partially built kitchen cabinet, but the cabinet maker didn't feel it was his job to move the bag, so he left it there, built the rest of the cabinet around it. I don't know where Bob found these people, but they were gems. Every one of them. I'm not sure if this is pro or not, but I got revenge on a douchebag I used to volunteer firefight with. This was in the early mid-2000s. I decided to go in the local fire department as a volunteer firefighter. I did it for about 5 years, and it was great. Training consisted of 3 months of fire training, 2 nights a week and all day Saturday, and then you would go to EMT training, another 3 months of training. I was about a year, and I was asked to help train some new recruits. One of the lieutenants, Amy, was a short, middle-aged woman who was so full of fire she could make a grown man cry. One of those people who commands both fear and respect wherever she went. Honestly, a great lieutenant and great person. When she wasn't being a drill sergeant, she was extremely kind and generous. She would often bake people cakes and treats and deliver them to the various stations in our department. However, in this new academy class that I was asked to help with, there was a cocky kid that we will call Aaron. Aaron talked big during the training and acted like he was the all-American hero, like he was going to be the lead badass in Backdraft 2. He performed moderately well in training, but far from the top of the class. He gets assigned to Amy's station, which is a pretty quiet station in the department. A few months after he starts, Amy swings by my station one night to say hi. She brings us the mother-lode cake from Claim Jumper, massive 6-layer cake. She explained that she had treated her crew to a night out at a Claim Jumper, which must have cost a lot of money. I think she took out about 8 people and bought a whole cake to top it all off. They had eaten the first 2 layers, so she gave us the remaining 4. We thanked her profusely, and she left. Back then, the big social media platform was MySpace, and I decided to look up some of the people in the department to make friends. I came across Aaron's page, and I noticed some photos of him and the rest of his crew at Claim Jumper with Amy. However, when I read the comments, he bragged about how he had purposefully ordered the most expensive dinner, appetizers, and drinks since Amy was buying. He bragged about how he was going to take advantage of her stupidity. This alone pissed me off because she was doing this super nice and generous. What an ungrateful, selfish dick. Then I read the rest of his profile. He had videos and memes on his page glorifying himself as a badass firefighter, bragging about running into burning building and how he was such a hero. He was flirting with girls, blatantly trying to impress them with how brave he is. Bear in mind, he just graduated from the academy 3 months prior and hadn't even gone to EMT school. He had never been to a house fire, and all he basically did was carry gear for the other fully qualified firefighters. It was too much for me to tolerate. So here's the revenge. I printed off copies of his MySpace page, including his comments about Amy and toxic bragging. I made multiple copies and took them to every station in the department. We all had pagers. God, I'm old. And a small keyboard at each station to send out text messages. I made an anonymous all-staff page to everyone in the department. I had to keep it brief since I couldn't fit a ton of characters. but I sent out his MySpace info and told everyone about how he treated Amy. Within an hour, Aaron had cleared out his MySpace page of all posts, photos, etc. A couple of days later, he deleted his account. It's a good thing I made so many copies. Immediately after this happened, he stopped coming to volunteer, and a few weeks later, I heard that he had quit. I later talked to Amy and admitted I was the one who sent the page. I told her I hated how he treated her, and she thanked me. She seemed really sad and hurt by what he had done. But being the tough, short lady that she was, she quickly got back into being an actual badass firefighter. She later started dating and married a fire chief that also helped at the academy. I've lost touch with her, but I hope she did well. She seemed pretty happy last time I saw her. Edit. I can't stop laughing about how this story ignited a firestorm about Claim Jumper's motherlode cake. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more captivating stories. Share your own experiences, opinions in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going. Until next time, stay tuned for more epic tales.